Hello and welcome to yet another session of the course Literary Criticism. Today we are continuing to discuss Longinus on the Sublime. In the 8th section, having told us about the test of literature and how he thinks universality, and if a set of elevated minds, a set of lofty minds agree upon the quality, the loftiness and the sublimity of a certain kind of literature, then it is bound to be great. And having said that, Longinus takes us to the next set of discussion in part 8, and there he states at the outset that he proceeds to enumerate the 5 principal sources of sublimity. And the clarity with which he continues to speak over here, the clarity with which he continues to write over here, it is really amazing. And given that it is one of the earliest manuscripts to be discovered about literary criticism, giving a lot of foundational mileage to what would later become Western literary criticism. These are the 5 principal sources that he identifies with regard to sublimity. The first one is grandeur of thought. Second is a vigorous and spirited treatment, as you can see here. The third, a certain artifice in the employment of figures. Fourth is dignified expression, which is again subdivided into proper choice of words and the use of metaphors and other ornaments. And the fifth one is majesty and elevation of structure. And look at these 5 forms, and there's a way in which he also further compartmentalizes these five different things. And the first 2 are part of nature, and the next set, the 3rd, 4th and 5th, they are part of art. Recall the earliest discussion that we had at the beginning of Longinus on the Sublime about how he believes that it's just genius will not produce any kind of great art. Along with genius, you also need a sense of direction. This technicality is equally important. So this is where, by identifying the 5 sources which also constitute elements from nature as well as art, the inherent genius as well as the technical training that one gets, he combines all these things in these 5 sources. And he keeps giving examples to, like he gives in the first one, grandeur of thought, as I have pointed out elsewhere on his work on Xenophon. And after having mentioned the second one, he states very clearly, these 2 conditions of sublimity depend mainly on natural endowments, whereas those which follow derive assistance from art. So here he continues to emphasize on the importance of the natural endowments and how the natural endowment can have a proper sense of direction. It can reach a proper fruition only if it also receives, only if those qualities also receive adequate training. And in the rest of the section, in section 8, he continues to give examples and continues to tell us about the things that that needs to be omitted in terms of language. And here there's another thing that we need to notice when he's identifying these 5 sources which are from nature as well as from art. It's largely about language. It is language which produces this loftiness. Of course, there is a there are a lot of technical elements which can perhaps fine-tune these aspects, but fundamentally it is about language which also has the ability to transport the reader out of himself or herself. And in section 9, this is how he begins. I've already said that all of these 5 conditions of the sublime, the most important is the first, that is a certain lofty cast of mind. Therefore, although this is a faculty rather natural than acquired, nevertheless, it will be well for us in this instance also to train up our souls to sublimity, and this is a very useful word, and to train up our souls to sublimity. While Longinus is talking about something very, very profound, something which is also very abstract, something which operates at a very different level altogether, rather than something which operates at a very different level altogether, he continues to focus on the need of good training and how, without appropriate training, without good training, the lofty mind perhaps cannot do anything much. Even if the lofty mind is endowed with a sense of the gift of sublimity, unless it is coupled with a proper training, it may not bear much fruition. And moving down, there's also this Platonian notion that he subscribes to. I've hinted elsewhere in my writings that sublimity is, so to say, the image of greatness of soul. And we find the perfect synergy of Plato's as well as Aristotle's ideals in Longinus on the Sublime. At some level, we find him being very, very Platonic, very, very Platonian when he talks about how good writing can only come from a lofty mind. On the other hand, there are also these technicalities and the practical aspects that he focuses on, just the way Aristotle had. There are these beautiful examples that he continues to give from contemporary art forms about the silence of Ajax in the 11th Odyssey is great and grander than anything he could have said. And look at the way in which he is giving this poignant example to talk about sublimity. It's not always about the use of ornamented language. It is not always about the use of language itself. Here he talks about how in a particular section where the silence of Ajax is more sublime, it's more grandeur than anything that he could have ever said. And here he also makes a further distinction that this eloquence that he talks about, this grandeur that he talks about in terms of language, it is not always about the spoken words. Let's read down further for to get a hang of what Aristotle is mentioning. To get a hang of what Longinus is mentioning, it's absolutely essential then first of all to settle the question whence this grandeur of conception arises. And the answer is that true eloquence can be found only in those whose spirit is generous and aspiring. We continue to see a very Platonian sense of this identification between lofty thoughts and lofty minds, and how only a noble soul can produce great literature. And he also makes this statement towards the end, hence sublime thoughts belong properly to the loftiest minds. We find here a lot of similarities between Longinus and other classical thinkers about this identification between lofty mind and lofty thinking, about lofty writing and lofty lofty souls. Here we also find that even when they are focusing on technical aspects, there is a sense of universality that they all subscribe to. There is a sense of a set of universal virtues, a set of universal ideals that they all subscribe to, and they also expect that the other critical minds, the other well-read, elevated minds will also be able to appreciate this. And look at the way in which he further clarifies this. For those whose lives are wasted in paltry and illiberal thoughts and habits cannot possibly produce any work worthy of the lasting reverence of mankind, it's only natural that their words should be full of sublimity, whose thoughts are full of majesty. And this equation is very, very clear in Plato, in Aristotle, as well as in Longinus. So we also find these overarching similarities over here, where the universality of human character continues to be underscored, continues to be reiterated. And that sense we will also begin to realize when we talk more about Aristotelian humanism later on, that there is an underlying principle of humanism that brought together almost all kinds of literary criticism of the earliest centuries. And we also find that, which is why there is a need at a later point to depart from the humanistic principles, which is why there's also a need to reconfigure the various ways in which humanism had been understood and talked about, and how that had manifested itself in different kinds of literature, and more importantly in different kinds of literary critical approaches. And to prove these points with concrete examples, he continues to give a lot of instances from contemporary Greek art and literature. And there are a lot of examples that he gives, Longinus gives, also to showcase what to avoid. And he clearly is not a big fan of any kind of ornamented language. In fact, he even warns the potential critic and the potential writer against the use of too many metaphors and too ornamented kind of language. And something which is extremely significant over here is this reference to the lawgiver of Jews and the images of Christianity which are used over here. And there is an excerpt from the book of Genesis from the Bible. God said, "What, let there be light, and there was light, and let there be land, and there was." This was considered as one of the hints to show the kind of learnedness and the kind of exposure that not just Longinus, but also the Greek learned society at large had at that point of time. And this quotation from the book of Bible, from the book of Genesis, considered extremely significant in situating the text in terms of these intertextual references and the manner in which different kinds of examples are being used to illustrate something what is predominantly part of literary criticism now. And there's a way in which he continues to quote from the great poet by referring to the examples from again from Odyssey, and he talks about various instances where he can locate these examples from within the text of Odyssey to show what needs to be done or what needs to be avoided. And there's something interesting that he remarks about Homer's mind. That's a great poet that he continues to refer to. But there's another and a very interesting aspect of Homer's mind. When we turn to the Odyssey, we find occasion to observe that a great poetical genius in the decline of power, which comes with old age, naturally leans towards the fabulous. And this leaning towards the fabulous is not something that Longinus entirely approves of. That is also seen as a degradation, as a decay of true genius. For it is evident that this work was composed after the Iliad, in proof of which we may mention, among many other indications, the introduction in the Odyssey of the sequel to the story of his hero's adventures at Troy, as so many additional episodes in the Trojan War, and especially the tribute of sorrow and mourning which is paid in that poem to departed heroes, as if in fulfillment of some previous design. The Odyssey is in fact a sort of epilogue to the Iliad. And for the same reason, I imagine, whereas in the Iliad, which was written when his genius was in its prime, and that's another important thing which he illustrates with this example of Homer, the transition in Homer's mind from the time he wrote Iliad and towards what Longinus sees as a kind of a decay or a degradation of his genius. And he says Iliad was written when his genius was in its prime. This is also Longinus' way of telling us that genius, it's not something which is permanent, and genius is not something which one can take for granted. Genius needs direction, genius needs technical training, and it is also not something which will stay permanently. There are phases, and what other best way to illustrate this rather than talking about Homer's mind and how his mind worked and how his genius was manifested in the composition of Iliad as well as Odyssey. The whole structure of the poem is founded on action and struggle. In the Odyssey, he generally prefers the narrative style, which is proper to old age. And look at the way in which these equations are made between the personality of the writer and the kind of writings that he or she produces, between the age, between the exposure and the kind of productions that at different age they are capable of. And here we also find Longinus moving a little bit away from the principles of universality, from the principles of universal virtue and universal way of looking at genius. We find that all these three masters, Plato, Aristotle as well as Longinus, even when they subscribe to the ideals of universality, even when they subscribe to the ideals of humanism, we find that there's a way in which they also make these fine distinctions about what to expect at various points of time. And perhaps it would be appropriate, and it would also be fair to say that maybe humanism was also a framework which was most handy when literary criticism was in its initial infant stages, and it also gave a lot of clarity and foundational mileage to what would later become the Western literary critical forte. We continue to engage with this example that he gives about Homer's mind. Hence, Homer in his Odyssey may be compared to the setting sun. He is still as great as ever, but he has lost his fervent heat. The strain is now pitched to a lower key than in the tale of Troy divine. We begin to miss that high and equable sublimity, which never flags or sinks, that continuous current of moving incidents, those rapid transitions, that force of eloquence, that opulence of imagery, which is ever true to nature. And I want you to connect this to the definition of sublime that he gives at the outset of the discussion. Longinus talks about sublimity as some thing, the lofty language which has the power to transport the reader out of himself or herself. And how does this happen? How does this language manifest itself? And it is in the continuous current of moving incidents, those rapid transitions, the force of eloquence, the opulence of imagery, and it is all true to nature. And this nature, which is also the inherent genius in the writer, it is combined and it is perhaps taken towards appropriate directions with good training, and that's a kind of sublimity which he says which never flags or sinks. There are no ups and downs in that kind of sublimity. It maintains a consistent level of elevated state, a consistent state of sublimity. As we move towards the end, there are various ways in which he brings in a lot of other imageries also to talk about what this quality of the sublime is. Like the sea when it retires upon itself and leaves its shores waste and bare, henceforth the tide of sublimity begins to ebb and draws away into the dim region of myth and legend. In saying this, I'm not forgetting the fine storm pieces in the Odyssey, the story of the Cyclops and other striking passages. It is Homer grown old I am discussing, but still it is Homer. Yet in every one of these passages, the mythical predominates over the real. And he talks about certain other things related to content as well. How when he moves from Iliad to Odyssey, we find that there are striking passages, of course, but there is also a predomination of the mythical over the real. In the later stage, and in Longinus' own words, Homer grown old. An older Homer is talking about the mythical more than the real. An older Homer is also using more fabulous passages, and there is a certain kind of steam that he loses out on. Homer continues to be Homer, but if Longinus were to compare Iliad with Odyssey, he would always say that Iliad was more sublime than Odyssey ever was. And in all of these examples, more than judging and evaluating Homer, Longinus is also giving us some practical examples of how to identify sublimity and how to use this in a practical sense in the context of literary criticism. And in this final passage with which he wraps up, he continues to talk about Odyssey. He continues to talk about the examples, and this is how he wishes to wrap up this discussion on the sublime. And he is also aware that it's a digression that he makes towards the end. If you look at the succession of events from the first section onwards, he begins by talking about sublimity. He talks about the various things that would make a work sublime and what are the sources of this sublimity and what are the different ways in which they can be achieved or not achieved and what could hamper your journey towards sublimity and what's the role of the reader. When he's talking about all of this, he is also conscious that towards the end he is evidently making a digression when he begins to talk about Homer's mind. My purpose in making this digression, as I said, is to point out what trifles the second childhood of genius is too apt to be betrayed. And there are different stages of genius, and this he wants the reader, the critic, to be aware of so that one does not make the mistake of judging the same writer's works, different works, in the same way. It's not that if the writer remains the same, all works will have the same level of sublimity. That is the profound point that Longinus is also trying to make towards the end of this discussion, to drive home the point that, to draw our attention to the point that even the same writer, even a writer like Homer, who is the greatest poet, who is like the sun, even when he is setting, he remains as great as ever. Even a poet like Homer, he is capable of producing two different kinds of works which are at the level of sublimity in two different levels. That's what Longinus is trying to argue out. And this is what he wraps up with. Another reason for these remarks on the Odyssey is that I wish to make you understand that great poets and prose writers, after they have lost their power of depicting the passions, turn naturally to the delineation of character. So look at another fine distinction that he makes in this transition of different forms of genius, and this he also talks about the second childhood of genius. And in the first stage, when Homer was writing Iliad, he was focusing on the passions, and then he turns naturally to the delineation of character, because that's another stage of his genius. That's the setting sun. That's that's a Homer grown old, who is focusing more on the character, who is focusing more on the fabulous language, who has moved away from depicting powerful emotions. And the other thing that he also noticed was that he has also moved away towards mythical characters than real ones. Such, for instance, is the lifelike and characteristic picture of the palace of Odysseus, which may be called a sort of comedy of manners. And look at these different kinds of interventions that Longinus is also capable of bringing in. And the other thing that needs to be mentioned about the structure of this manuscript is that this is a retrieved manuscript and it has been translated over and again. So there could be perhaps a chance that there was another conclusion which went missing, or there were parts which were missing in between. But nevertheless, the point that we need to keep in mind, that one needs to reiterate, is that Longinus talks about sublimity. He gives a theoretical framework to talk about sublimity, and he also shows us how the technical training is equally important in nurturing genius, and how that and those aspects and those sources that he identifies, they all can be collectively used to talk about literature using critical yardsticks. So with this, we begin to wrap up our discussion on Longinus on the Sublime, and we will also come back to some of these points at a later point, especially when we discuss how Scott James identified Longinus as a first romantic poet. And here's where we also begin to see the connections between the early century Greek texts and how literary criticism was dealt with then, and how to make this connection across towards the Romantic period, and to see how it becomes possible to situate Longinus within a different framework altogether, within the 18th century, 19th century framework, when the discussion is predominantly about Romanticism. With this, we wrap up today's discussion. I thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.